1, 2, 3, let's go.
Wednesday afternoon, hoping you will tune into our show.
For that, so all in all, it's probably best not to do that. So that's an automatic thing. We can do, whenever we're on autopilot, we can do more than one thing. Perhaps one of the hardest things I think I can remember ever learning, and I taught myself when I was young, to play the drums. Now, anyone who plays the drums knows that you've got 4 limbs and they're all doing something different. So when you start, you think this is just completely impossible. It's just not possible, because you've got, if you're right-handed, right-footed, you've got your right foot on the bass drum pedal, your left foot on the what they call the hi-hat cymbals. That's 2 cymbals clamped together, and you press it up and down or not. You've got your left hand on a snare drum, keeping the basic tempo, often the opposite beats to the bass drum, sometime in keeping with the hi-hat beat. And then your right hand will often be touching regular points, the hi-hat cymbal or a crash cymbal, something like that. So once you're doing the basic drumming process, it's great, and you can do it again without really thinking about it. You may have to think about the drum fills you do, which are a bit different, but the actual drumming, you can do it, and you can sing a song as you do it, as some drummers do. But anyone starting drumming will find it almost impossible to do that. So again, it's an example of when we can multitask. And indeed, playing a guitar, when you learn, your fingers won't go automatically to the chord places, and it's a struggle. When you're experienced, you can sing, you can play along and not think about the guitar, because that's the way it is. So they are good examples of multitasking. But in reality, in truth, it is a myth. Because, as I say, the brain won't let us do more than one thing at a time. Right. And the brain is, people say, well, where does multitasking come in the brain? How does it do it? And without going into the operation of the brain, that's for another day. It's apparently in the prefrontal cortex, a region at the front of the brain, which then looks at the task and allocates the steps within the brain, which part does which part, and then responds accordingly. So, I mean, that becomes ever more complex, but it still comes to the same conclusion. It won't let us do more than one thing simultaneously, or think one thing simultaneously. Now, what is the point of all this? Well, maybe it's good to have an understanding that we're not able really to multitask, not very easily. And it's not necessarily a good thing that we do, because often, certainly if you're in a work setting or indeed any setting, if you can only really give full focus to one thing. And therefore, if you're trying to juggle, what we really do, researchers say what we're really doing is task switching, not multitasking, but task switching. So we go from one thing to another and really not giving any of them necessarily sufficient attention. And therefore mistakes can be made. If we try to do too many things at once, we lower productivity of how it all works. So maybe an understanding that we can't easily multitask, and even when we think we can, because we're driving perhaps, or whatever else that may be automatic, we still have to have a mind to the fact that something could crop up there which would interrupt that automated situation. We talk of autopilot, and we know that aeroplanes, once they get up higher, they put on autopilot. So the pilots can actually, where they're monitoring the instruments, they can talk about this, that, and the other quite safely, because the autopilot is doing the heavy lifting, literally, on the aeroplane. So, we can say multitasking happens to an extent, but to a large extent, it really doesn't, and it's a myth. So that's my thinking on multitasking. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just a realization that our limitations in what we can think is very much, we are enshrined in the
leader of our gang will make the show go with a bang, and fund the aim of everything cost us, and fund the aim of everything cost us.
Much we are enshrined in the present moment, aren't we? We cannot ever escape the present moment. On any given time, we're stuck in that moment. We might think about what's happened, we might think about the future, but we're always in the present moment. And it is that limited span in the present moment is why the brain only lets us focus on one thing at a time and not more than one. As I say, if I asked you to think about what I'm saying and at exactly the same time to think about something else entirely, something you've done this morning, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. And I think another example of that is if I'm writing an email, perhaps writing a complaint or whatever I might be writing it about, I can't also have a conversation with somebody about something else while I'm writing that email. It'll be constantly switching from one to the other. And the only thought on that I sometimes have is I might be reading and the TV or radio might be on in the background, and I might be engrossed in a book or on the phone or whatever, and then somehow the brain allows a trigger. You might hear something that is said on a program or whatever on the radio, and you think, oh, what was that? Even though you were fully engrossed in the book. It happens to us, and the brain is clever in that way. And so you could argue that it does just have a little radar out for certain trigger things that we might need to know. So that's again an incredible part of our brain system. But as I say, overall, it's as well to realise we task switch, and therefore it's better to give our best attention to what is at hand, especially if it's a priority thing, rather than just thinking, well, I've got to do 5 things, I'll try and do them all at once, because it just doesn't work. And it's quite interesting looking into this as to how our brains function on this and what research has shown. So perhaps the bottom line is that us men and the women, we're both pretty hopeless at it. There's no real member of which sex is any better than the other. We're all pretty hopeless at multitasking. Not a positive note to end on, but that's the reality of it.
Well, I think the women might tend to disagree with us.
Well, I'm sure they will, but they may be better at getting a lot of things done in one go. But they are still pacing themselves to do one thing at a time. They can't give the kids their breakfast while they're also trying to get themselves ready for work. It's a juggle the whole time. And to be fair to women, we all know that their lives often are a massive juggle, especially with a young family. But the fact is, they're not multitasking all those things at the same time, because it won't work, and you will end up doing nothing particularly well. That's the problem with it, I think.
Yeah.
And I take your point, so they probably won't agree with what we're saying here.
Yeah, because while you were saying about multitasking, and you said about women being able to do it whilst men struggle with it or whatever, it just reminds me of my mom. So for instance, I can take my mom out for a meal, and we'll be sat at the table, and she'd be listening to conversations like 3 tables away. And I don't know how she does it.
No, absolutely.
I kid you not. And I'll be like, yeah, Mom, are you listening to me? She goes, yeah. Do you know that couple down there? I go, right. And then she'll tell me exactly what they're saying. And I couldn't do it. I'll be sat there going, how could you possibly know that? She said, yeah, because I've been listening. And I say to her, well, you're not listening to me then if you're listening there. I said, tell me the last thing I said. And she'll repeat it. And I don't get, so they must have some ability.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And actually that brings up a point which I haven't mentioned, but apparently a lot of research has shown that 2.5% of the population are actually good at multitasking. In other words, it's a very unusual ability to have, for the reasons I've said, that the brain doesn't really allow that to happen. But it says 2.5% of people, which is a very small percentage, isn't it? It's about 1 in 40 people, I think. Can multi.
Make the show go with a bang and fund the aim of everything cast us and fund the aim